We are going to talk about the role of education research and the practice within the context of current debates about race and racial equity. We're going to address 3 questions. Is it possible to measure racial progress and chart a path toward further progress? Are racial conciliation and interest convergence panaceas to quell discontent and to avoid difficult issues? Or are they viable pathways to promote access and justice? And what is the role of educational research, practice, and policy in this discussion? And our title is Racial Conciliation, Interest Convergence, and the Role of Education and Schooling. And I'm Nailah Nasir, and I'm going to serve as your chair this afternoon. So we thought we would start just asking each of the panelists to take about 10 minutes to enter whatever part of that conversation strikes you. And then we'll have maybe a bit of discussion among the panel, and then we'll throw it open to the audience for participation, questions, and comments. So, James, would you like to start?
Thank you. Thank you again. It's a pleasure being here, and I look forward to the conversation that our comments will engender at the end. I helped me structure my ideas. I've sort of written my comments, so I hope that's not offensive if I read them. Thank you. So we're at a critically important, compelling, and instructional historical moment. Race and racial equity concerns continue to capture the nation's attention and its social imagination, but in ways that seem new and yet very familiar. Discourses surrounding the mattering of black folk undergirding new and old conversations among those who are generally concerned about the life chances of black people, and also by others who are unsettled and perplexed by direct and unapologetic messaging of the importance of black lives. State-sanctioned contempt and violence directed toward vulnerable youth in many locations nationally are of concern. These vulnerabilities, as well as the social context and political processes that breed them, have caused many, including those in the education research community, to ponder their meaning at this particular time. And as we think about this moment, we also grapple with the implications for education research and policy, and how we reconcile race and racial disparities with the goal of advancing educational opportunity. Although I don't accept the claim that current race relations are at an all-time low, but clearly current levels and manifestations of racial animus are important to consider. So how do we begin to understand this? Well, schools and schooling may be an appropriate place to start. For example, the research on the effects of the racial composition of schools provides an informative portal to review issues of race and inequality in education. Research findings are pretty clear about the positive effects for black students attending desegregated schools. And the caveat is attending effective desegregated schools. These effects have generally focused on achievement outcomes. With related interests, contact theorists argue that racial animus is reduced in these desegregated schooling environments. However, cautions about the single story may hold true in this case. So, is this the only narrative, especially for a new generation of students who have come of age in an area of heightened racial rhetoric, consciousness, and new racial realities? So given this example, what questions should we be asking about the effects of racial composition in schools in particular? Please note that desegregated and segregated schooling spaces are really experienced at the continuum, such as more or less integration, if you will, more or less desegregation. Also, the idea of racial composition thresholds or tipping points need more exploration. Having said that, here's a question. To what extent does school racial composition reduce racial animus for students whose identities and experiences are also informed by other important social contexts and mediating factors, such as family, neighborhood, faith, gender identity, class, and social media engagement, for instance? Interestingly, what's caught my attention recently includes other race-related factors. such as the development of racial identity and its relationship to academic and social outcomes. And to push a more controversial point of inquiry, are there positive effects of racially segregated schooling, such as the experience of students in indigenous schools, African-centered schools, or even at black colleges? If so, are these outcomes for students in these settings important enough to advance a policy agenda around segregated schooling, if it's effective in that way? With a spotlight on student activism and protests motivated by anger over police brutality and mass incarceration, in addition to other race-based problems, college students and others voicing and enacting their frustration about racial injustice as part of the larger Black Lives Matter movement. And over the past couple of years, for instance, college campuses and in some secondary school spaces have been animated by increased demands from students of color for institutional change related to incidents of racial hostility and marginalization. Here, the role of education research appears obvious. If the objective is to capture the meaning of students' protests and demands and theorizing their racial experiences in college. What is less obvious, however, is how policy and practice at the institutional level and beyond are implicated and used to affect change and reconcile historic and contemporary problems of racial identity on campus and beyond, racial inequality on campus and beyond. Like what is happening in higher education, I continue to be fascinated with theoretical, empirical, and practice-based questions at the intersection of race and educational opportunity, especially related to the experience of and outcomes of youth of color, particularly black boys and young men. For sure, the problems of racial inequity haunt us, but surprisingly, not solely because of our inability to solve these problems, rather because we have not focused enough on what is meant by and how to measure racial equity, racial progress, and racial justice in our goal to advance educational opportunity. In other words, what are the indicators of success or accomplishment for this work? I would suggest that the reduction of race-based achievement and disparities around performance should not only be a part of the goal, should be a primary part of our goal of racial progress and racial justice in education. Simply, is it possible for us to consider other indicators of progress and achievement that includes measures and narratives of racial identity, consciousness, and solidarity? To end, I'm convinced that at this current historical moment and period of political uneasiness, it affords us a unique opportunity to expand our notions and perspectives for knowing and understanding the problems of racial inequality in education. But this stubborn question remains: in what ways will we be engaged in this broader research project, and with what analytic frames and approaches? And lastly, to what end, for what purpose, and for what goals? Thank you.
Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. Thank you for being here. My name is Stella Flores. I'm an associate professor at NYU. I also direct the Steinhardt Institute, the Access and Equity programs for the Steinhardt Institute for Higher Education Policy. And I want to begin by thanking AERA for covering this important topic and the opportunity to speak to it directly. This is something I've been thinking about for a long time, not only because of personal reasons, but also because this concept of racial progress helped my parents earn a college degree. I am where I am because people work together to dismantle harmful laws that destroyed one's dignity and opportunity to become educated. I married outside of my race without a second thought because of people who took a stand to make this a legal choice, and now we have marriage equality. I am here because of racial progress that went beyond a black and white paradigm, and I have a responsibility to give back through my profession and my person. I'm a Mexican American woman who keeps getting mistaken for a maid or a nanny. Just most recently, I think one of my fellow faculty members in my faculty complex where I live, I think thought I was the dog nanny, and asked me to move so his dog could do his business. And I said, no, I'm not moving. You have to wait till I'm done. And he said, well, I live here. I should be here. And I said, sir, I live here too. What makes you think that I don't live here? And he walked away angry. So 4 degrees, 2 from Harvard, none of this matters. My husband, who's African American, faces different challenges on the street. He is perceived differently. I don't think that man would have approached him in the same way. But at the same time, when he walks away without his phone, I immediately clam up and start to freak out, because if he goes somewhere without his phone and something happens, there's nothing to record what might happen. There's nowhere to call. Many of you know these challenges, but I think marrying into it now brings a level of clarity and urgency that I never felt before. People aren't scared of me. They dismiss me. But I think they should be a little scared of me. So let me begin with my first point. Before we begin to measure racial progress, we have to ensure that we make it part of the inequality conversation. And I mention this because while AERA clearly recognizes the role of race in education and other forms of identity, there are many places that do not, where income is the only allowable form of inequality on the table. And while we should pay important attention to income, it is not the only inequality that is facing our nation. My second point has to do with the process of measuring racial progress, and to that I ask about seats at the table. How does your table look? Can we be more inclusive in who you choose to break bread with? However, in reality, we also need more than seats at the table. What is required more than ever is the act of speaking up for each other. This means not pitting one group against another in the fight for racial equity in the United States. I was trained at the Civil Rights Project at Harvard, where I also met Dan. And as a graduate student, I worked along a multiracial, multicultural team of researchers working for increased rights in education. This experience cemented some of the most important lessons of my life that I try to impart to my own students today. I learned there that it was important to speak up for others. But watching others not of my own race speak up for me and others that did not look like them was a profound experience.
So the labs are here. We only need 4.
And frankly represents the faith that I continue to have in this country. But a companion lesson to this strategy is also that it's important to be transparent about the likelihood that there will be costs to working on the side of racial progress, if you choose to be part of that side of history. I've spent time with a lot of university leaders, mostly white, that want to advise on what to do about diversity, what to do about racial unrest. And the one thing I feel is often understated, or maybe people know this deep down, is that leadership in the area of civil rights and racial equality has many costs, in that it's not easy work and people have given their lives, people of all races and backgrounds. Leadership in this area may cost you friends, fancy committees, perhaps even some grants. But the investment in current and future generations will leave something that can't be quantified, a benefit that moves forward for multiple generations. And that is allowing the security to be just a bit more free than those before them. What you do when you provide opportunity and freedom to others is free up human capital talent to be a stronger version of themselves. Because you see, this is what discrimination does to the discriminated. It prevents you from being your best self because you are too busy fighting and surviving battles of prejudice. Now, my encounter with the older man on the street, it took about an hour to shake it off, but it was an hour I could have spent writing. This is how I'm processing it. So this is why we must speak up for each other, because when we do, we allow for someone to thrive. Our efforts might just help one escape discriminatory practices and circumstances that impede the production of the highest quality of human and social capital. So I'll end with the question of educational research and practice, and to that I point to 3 areas. The first is acknowledging and embracing the profound demographic transformation that this country finds itself today and will continue to do so in the future. And coupled with this demographic transformation is the increasing inequality in wealth and increased segregation in our schools and neighborhoods. In fact, I would argue that in many ways segregation has become normalized, where in many circles questions are no longer about why our schools look the way they do, what has caused this segregation, but rather a faultless perception that there are simply just not enough white kids to go around. If we know the history of the nation, we know that that can't be the way we frame segregation. Next, I want to remind us about how to reframe thinking about immigrant and English learners. And in our research here in Texas with my colleagues Toby Park and Tim Drake, we found that students who were ever English learners and enroll in college programs actually had lower remediation rates than American-born black students. In other words, and in other work, we found that Latino students who transition out of English learner programs do better on long-term educational outcomes than similar students who were not as identified as English learners. Language is not a culprit. English learner and immigrant students are not deviants. They're just as capable and smart as any other child. They just happen to be proficient in another language other than English. My final point has to do with a continued focus on black students in this country. In every study I have conducted, they're the group most likely to be less academically prepared in this nation. We are only as strong as our vulnerable students, our most vulnerable students, and we have failed black students in this country. We continue to fail black students in this country, and the data could not be more clear. So to that end, that is the ultimate gauge for us on how we're moving forward and why schools are so important. I'll stop there.
Wow, that's, thank you, Stella, that was amazing. My name's Dan Lawson. I'm the director of the Center for Civil Rights Remedies at the Civil Rights Project at UCLA. And I want to thank AERA for putting this panel together and for inviting me to participate. It's an honor, and so thank you. I think this is a really important question that comes up in a lot of the work I've been doing for the Civil Rights Project. And to put the second question is, I'm going to start there. So the question is, are racial conciliation and interest convergence panaceas to quell discontent and to avoid difficult issues, or are they viable pathways to promote access and justice? And I would say it depends. So it can be either, it can work in a negative way, or there are opportunities, there is a potential for pathways. So to put this in the context of No Child Left Behind. So through my work with the Civil Rights Project, working with researchers and advocates, and I'm a lawyer and a researcher, one of the things that I was trying to do is to bring the research to inform the legislative branch as they were negotiating over No Child Left Behind, before it was called that, as to how to address racial disparities in education and outcomes, and how to make it's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, how to make it more effective. And so I was very much part of the conversations, and in the room where other even very highly esteemed lawyers and researchers were having these discussions. But there was an interest convergence piece because we were dealing with the Bush administration. In the Bush administration, maybe there were people of varied opinions, but I didn't really think that racial equity was primary in terms of their interest. I think there was concerns that the administration, but also Republicans in Congress, were interested in privatizing education and taking money away from those who needed it most, and subsidizing private schools, and going toward vouchers. They wanted a block grant. Title I, which was part of the war on poverty, but also one of the major leverage points for having desegregation, because it was the receipt of federal funds is what made federal civil rights law powerful. Because the threat was you could withdraw your federal funding if you weren't desegregating the schools and so forth. So Title I was actually very much a part of a desegregation plan when it was originally passed. So here we have the newest version of Title I being argued over, and folks want to block grant it, give it to states and let them do whatever they want. They want to provide vouchers, school choice, all those things are on the table at the same time. So it's a classic case of interest convergence, because the civil rights, there was bargaining going on, and one of the things was about having subgroup accountability and having some standards for progress. So both those things were achieved, and the civil rights community, I won't say who was saying what at the time, but there was a lot of infighting among civil rights attorneys about what was the right way to go about this, and how much do we give into, say, school choice, or the fact that in No Child Left Behind, when you close down a inadequate school, all the school closure issues, they would be reconstituted as charters as one of the measures. Another major issue, everyone I think was on the same page in terms of wanting to shine a bright light on inadequacy as it affected English learners, as it affected black children and Latino children and Native American children. And so there was, finally, we have something that's race conscious. We have a federal piece of legislation. It's not just all kids have to succeed, but you can't leave any subgroup behind. They all had to reach proficiency in 12 years. And aspirationally, as civil rights advocates, we all felt that we should be there already. And speed was important. So 12 years was not soon enough from an aspirational standpoint. But of course, from a researcher's standpoint, I mean, oftentimes I refer to it as, the hard bigotry of inadequate resources, because from a researcher's standpoint, there was no money in No Child Left Behind to get from A to B. And the researchers could tell you that to achieve the kinds of progress that were required in 12 years, with all kids of every subgroup proficient at 100% proficiency, the money wasn't there. So you're setting schools up to fail. And what happens when the schools fail? We get more school choice, which was more charters. But there is also interest convergence there, because many of us are trying to look for a leverage point to get out of the sort of district boundaries after Milliken v. Bradley, which is the Detroit, Michigan case, where they said the suburbs weren't responsible for the patterns of segregation, so they weren't part of the solution, and so that you couldn't require any kind of desegregation to address the educational inadequacies. So here we have an opportunity in No Child Left Behind that when a school or a district is failing, it wasn't just within district choice, but there was a provision in the law that says the students from the failing schools could go to another district. Of course, through the negotiation, it wasn't a hard and fast requirement. They had to have other districts buy into that and agree, and it was one of the provisions of No Child Left Behind that most people don't know about, but partly because it was almost never implemented. It almost never actually happened. But as civil rights lawyers, we saw, well, here's a potential tool to break down some of the barriers that are entrenching racial and socioeconomic isolation. So all these things, there were potentials, and everyone's sort of thinking about, what are some of the footholds. So one of the major ways that research comes into play is what is realistic progress given the amount of funding that was there. What can we say as researchers and how should we measure progress? A big problem with No Child Left Behind is all test scores. So if there's an incentive to push out kids who are low achieving, if all you care about is the test scores. Now, on the other flip side, we were able to get a piece about graduation rates and making that part of the accountability system. So here's another sort of interesting piece. They required that there be improvement on graduation rates and for subgroups, right? So that was part of the statute, but they didn't tell states what was the standard for progress. So most states, left to their own devices, said, well, any progress, so 1/10 of 1%. So I pointed out after the fact, when we're trying to get more rigorous kinds of progress at the state level, that if you were in California and the graduation rate was about 50%, it would take you 500 years to get to the goal of 100% at 1/10 of 1%. But that's what most states were saying was adequate progress for graduation rates. They had to make 100% proficiency on test scores and 1/10 of 1% of graduation rate. So what that meant is that you still have these incentives to push kids out. So now the whole piece about the school to prison pipeline was going on well before then, and a lot of it was response to integration. So students would now be suspended, they would be low track, put in special ed classes at higher rates when integration was required. And so part of the problem here is that if you're only looking at test scores, you're not really counting graduation rates. There is an incentive to push out the low achievers or the kids who the teachers and the administrators don't really care about as much and who don't have a voice at the table. So all these things, all these sort of potential problems were part of this negotiated piece. But I do think, research plays a really important role to speak truth to power. So to say, no, 1/10 of 1% means nothing, and is really, there is no incentive to really, point out that the test scores or the tests are way overblown, and that we need other sort of indicators of progress that aren't based on, some of the tests are maybe racially biased in themselves, but the fact that the decision to make test scores, the almost the sole indicator of progress, was also, I think, in part, it was almost like a planned obsolescence. We knew all these schools would fail. And so who was interested in saying public schools are failing and we shouldn't fund them, or we should have vouchers, or we should charter? So that it was not the civil rights advocates that were wanting to do that. So oftentimes, and I even still think now, people say, well, they'll stop reporting data. Well, there is this sort of bizarre interest in having data on students of color, on English learners, as long as it's negative. So it's really important as well to have research that is showing what's progress and showing what's working, so that when we are engaged with these sort of political discussions, that we have really strong evidence of what works, and then we have realistic, policies and practices that are realistic. They're not based on, pure politics, but there's real information there. So I think that's critically important. So here's another example of interest convergence, which is in my work on looking at the school to prison pipeline. I know that there are folks that are pushing back and for various reasons, and that don't care about social justice. They don't care one whit about it. But I still want to reach them because I do, and if they're in positions of power and I'm trying to convince them to change, it's like I will use a different argument if it's going to be effective. So one of the things that we've done is we have research. I have this new piece out with Russ Rumberger on the high cost of suspensions. And we also have, there's some racial breakdowns in here, but the point is California has done some progress to address, these huge racial gaps with really high volumes of students who are being kicked out of school right and left. But no one talks, we say invest in schools, not prisons, but no one's really put dollars, clearly monetize what that means. And so there are folks who don't care about exclusionary discipline, except for when you point out that as taxpayers it's horribly inefficient, that it's really detrimental to everybody, and not just to students of color, but it really is hurting. It's a really unsound investment to have kids going to school and be kicking them out right and left, and that there are other ways to address this that are cost effective, that we wind up with kids who are really effective and you know, part of a vibrant part of the economy, and they're successful. And they don't care about that from a racial perspective, but the fact is that if it pushes back on the zero tolerance policy that is, you know, contributing to the mass incarceration and the new Jim Crow, well, I'm going to use an argument that someone's going to hear. So I think that's, you know, really important for all of us in terms of researchers to think about, you know, what are the alternative kinds of arguments that will appeal to people that don't necessarily aren't, you know, caring the way you are caring.
Thank you. That was stimulating. I think maybe partly for my own benefit, I've been thinking a lot about the language that we're using in framing this session: racial progress, racial conciliation, interest convergence. And it may be partly because, you know, I'm in a role right now where my title is Vice Chancellor of Equity and Inclusion. And so I think a lot about the euphemisms we use to talk about things that we don't really want to name. So I guess I want to ask you, we're using the term racial progress and assuming that we know what it means by it and that we're sharing a definition with the audience, but what does that mean to you, racial progress? Anybody who wants to take it up?
I'll go first and try to sort of get on it from my perspective. I have lots of concerns about racial disparities across the education pipeline. And I've often thought that trying to close those gaps, be that at sort of achievement, performance, attainment, that if we close those gaps, then those would be indicators of racial progress concerning sort of educational outcomes. I'm beginning to think more sort of in depth about that. That I think we can close some gaps and still not have the kind of racial progress that we want. So it's getting me to think differently and more expansively about racial progress. I think one of the purposes of the session is to get us talking about it and not assuming that we all know what it is, and it may vary based on sort of the kind of work that people do and the kind of spaces that people do their work. So this larger point about, I would like us to move beyond thinking about disparities and gaps in achievement and attainment as the primary way to sort of measure, understand racial progress. And I entered that conversation with my comments based on kind of a broader swath of work around the effects of desegregated schools. And that's how I've been sort of thinking about and trying to push against that by asking sort of more expansive questions about, can we, in that instance, can we think about understanding desegregation in other ways than sort of achievement outcomes? That's why. So when we think about the literature, it's really. I was talking to Joe Mills Braddock yesterday, and I said I'm going to make this comment, and your work has sort of informed the nation, mostly about the effects, and he wanted me to make sure I say effective desegregated schools, because that goes to this idea that you could have desegregated schools that are not effective and not improving the kind of the learning outcomes of students. So I've said all that to say, I don't know.
Because I guess I'm going to leave the question open for you all if you want to jump in on this. But I guess part of what I'm pushing for is we leave out the politics of it, right? We leave out how desegregation was partly because Black people knew they couldn't get the resources if they stayed in separate spaces, but maybe if the spaces were integrated, it would be harder for white people to withhold the resources, thus produce greater equity, right? It's not just but we sell it as a kind of ideal in and of itself. I think that's, anyway, either of you on racial progress?
I think I resonate with your definition. I see it as the dismantling of barriers as one metric, but racial progress also So, being a child of an immigrant, I also think about it as, do I have more opportunity than the generation before me? So intergenerational mobility, I see as it, and do all races have the same opportunity to have intergenerational mobility? But being a student of law and policy, right, I first looked at where are the barriers and some of those major laws that thankfully were dismantled. But then now there are all these secret little laws or secret little practices that we don't want to call out, that we know are leading to more inequitable outcomes. But yeah, so we didn't create the language on this panel. We just decided to.
No, I'm not critiquing. What's interesting in what you're saying is that inequity is gotten more sophisticated. Right.
Right. And I would add, clearly it's not just having a black president. It's not, that's a modicum of racial progress, but certainly that's nowhere near sufficient. But I think one of the things that we have to think about is, dismantling structural racism. So it's not just winning an election here or there, or taking over a school board so that it reflects what it looks like in one community. But I think, if race is a social construct, we have to address racism and its legacy and how there are these structures and barriers that are much more than an immediate political decision in 1 year or 4 years or 8 years. And to dismantle that is, a much deeper piece of work, but it's something that we have to constantly be striving for. And so I think, it's really important not to lose sight of that, and we have to enjoy the small victories that we have, but understand that there's such a, basically when folks are not thinking about it, once they've fully addressed racism and racism doesn't exist, that's when we'll have made racial progress, but we're so far from that.
I like this, the notion of movement, right? Because then I sometimes feel like things are so messed up that it's totally hopeless. And so I have a long story about that. I won't share it. But the idea that we're tracking movement in a direction is kind of also a space of holding hope. Yeah. Well, let's open up to the audience. Join us. Thoughts, questions in this area? Yes. Let's give him a chance to answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So are we? Are we in a losing battle?
I think where you ended, although we might disagree about the hope, I think where you ended is that yes, it's about changing hearts and minds eventually. So I remember, Connie Rice saying some of the similar things that I was saying. I'll whatever it takes to convince them to change the policy, I'll meet them. I'll present an argument that will be persuasive if it's going to end a racist policy. But at the end of the day, to really implement what you put in place, you do have to change hearts and minds. But I do think that's possible. So I think that at the end of the day, we are all humans. We are not, racism is a social construct, but it is one that is affecting us and how we operate as human beings. But it's not, racism is not advantageous to the human race. It could lead to a nuclear annihilation. It could leads to wars and pain and suffering for everybody. Even the oppressors are really just naive at how racism and hatred, it undermines us all because they really aren't, we all are humans at the end of the day. And we all live on the same planet, and we can self-destruct. So the most negative version of that, if it is something we can't get beyond, I do think we'll be extinct fairly shortly.
This point about the sort of permanency of racism. I think the interest conversion comes out of that reality, and interest conversion becomes a really practical way of trying to get stuff done and getting people stuff. And I think we'll see more of that as people sort of continue to move in a way where they think that it's a losing battle. And given that the battle is lost far afield, I'm going to get everything I can right now. And as a policy expert, you would know this, that sort of policy is at sort of all levels, local, state, and federal levels, they're piecemeals and a way of trying to get resources for folk, and folk agreeing to things that they normally, in this kind of larger context. I'm going to give an example, particularly in the current political setting at the national level, and it works, and it's also at the state level, the kind of current status of historically black colleges. Black colleges, in their main, how they're operating in terms of the resources, it's a larger project of interest conversion, I would argue, particularly in the current federal administration. And if you look at public black colleges at the state level and talk to people, you will clearly understand that administrators and supporters and advocates of black colleges at the state level are giving way to kind of policies and strategies to get other resources in that way. So again, that's, I think, a really interesting sort of example of kind of interest conversion. And I want to connect that to this larger idea about how do we measure sort of racial sort of progress. And I think it's a sort of point in kind of monitoring, sort of advancement, sort of incremental. One of sort of supposedly outcomes is that we'll think about, engage, and actually have different institutions if we make racial progress. We won't have sort of underfunded schools for certain populations in certain communities. So this kind of the whole language of desegregation was about sort of abolishing these institutions. Now at the same time, it's again to enter this conversation about the role of black colleges. And we have a White House who says on the surface that we support these institutions and we want more funding for them as a kind of discrete interest conversion strategy. Does that mean that as an indicator of racial progress, these institutions won't exist as they are, or they exist in fewer numbers? I think those are the kinds of questions that we should be mindful of, to think about, well, what does racial progress means in terms of the ability and accessibility and even the existence of these institutions.
So, as a student of policy, which clearly you are as well, I mean, my co-panelists here have answered this very nicely. I'm just going to hit on the reality side, and you know, and in a fight for equality, especially racial equality, I feel like every day is a negotiation, especially in legislatures, in boardrooms, in hiring committees, and we have to learn how to make the case and how to make different arguments. So, you know, I never really call it interest convergence because it didn't come up in my mindset. So it just like naturally, I just call it what is for the greater good. And I think in states like Texas that are now predominantly minority in the schools and specifically predominantly Latino, like the state will fail if we do not educate its citizens. So I guess call that interest convergence, but that's just like economics and welfare of the human race in Texas. So I've just learned how to reframe it in different ways based on the audience.
Yeah, thank you. Is there another question? Yes. Yeah, so the question is, this isn't a problem just of education, but it's a broader problem, and how do we as education researchers bring people in from other aspects of society to kind of work on? Even the problem you mean is racism? Right. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
One area that research has really helped a lot with recently, that's not just education, is with regard to implicit bias. So the fact that we're living and breathing sort of this toxic soup that's loaded with racism and sexism and on. And so what do we do with that? So even if you're African American, you may have a bias against black people, and certainly most white folks do. And there are ways to actually measure it. You know, neurologists have developed tests to help us reflect. And then the question is, so what do you do about it? And I think one of the most important things that research is starting to suggest is really devoting time and energy, and this happens in schools, but it's also police, to knowing people, to connecting person to person, developing positive relationships. So, you know, for classroom teachers, research suggests it's not really clear. It wasn't about an implicit bias, but the teachers that were trained to be better at engaging with their students and engaging with parents saw a dramatic reduction in who they're sending kids to the office and kicking kids out of class generally, but also the racial disparities disappeared. And so it's possible, I don't know, because the focus of that research wasn't on bias, but it's possible that would explain it. As the more we really get to know each other, there is more to us than our race. And so making those human connections is sort of the antidote. And so I think implicit bias research has a lot to teach us in both as in education, but elsewhere as well.
Thank you. I serve on the State Board of Education in Colorado, and we just went through a whole year with stakeholders around the state about the monies, the Title I monies, the federal monies, and how we were going to spend them. So here we are at the very end. We get the results. You know, at the state board, we're at a board meeting just a few weeks ago, and one of the board members, a white man who happens to be Republican, says, "Okay, I don't care. I mean, there's the money. Really, what is there for us, you know, regular folk, as if Latinos are not." Black people are not regular folk, but he was talking about white people. What was there for white people in this money, you know. And really, they made so the stakeholders, and there were all these nonprofits and the business communities and such, took whatever they could, and they were downright out for white people, you know, suburbans, and really nothing for rural folk and poor folk. And it was just very disheartening for him to be the leader of this group and to end up with this question, well, what is there for me or for us?
Thoughts? Yeah, any thoughts or reactions?
Sure. I mean, it connects with your earlier question. Look, voting matters. Who you vote for matters incredibly, and this is beyond the schools, right? Who you vote for gets appointed to these major boards, and you know, for me, one of the biggest interventions that is undercounted, that is related to educational progress, is you know, what we do at the voting booth, how areas are gerrymandered. All that connects to who we can put in places that will help students. And right now, it's not structurally designed for poor people to have a voice, or for minorities. There will always be limited resources. So we have to, yeah. But should limited resources be for those who go to the polls, or should limited resources be for those who need them most, right? And that's a question we have to ask ourselves of our American character.
We are at the end of our time. Please join me in thanking our panelists. World. I was thinking 3:15. We have until 3:45. We have plenty more time for a conversation. All right. There's a question there in the back. Did you want to get in on this one?
Yeah,
go ahead. Yeah.
So one of the things I also was thinking, just off the top of my head, was thinking about was arts education, and arts and music in general does, I think, is sometimes very effective of helping folks connect across racial, cultural divides in a very powerful and important way. Although there's also the problem of, you know, white folks and whatever group is in power appropriating the art or the culture of another and exploiting it in a way that, you know, could be detrimental. But that realistic concern aside, I think one of the problems that we're seeing is the demise of arts education. And one of the things I hope to do someday is to get some funding to address art as a civil right and really document the huge disparities in who has access to arts education and music education, and what that means in terms of, you know, also cultural denigration when folks of color don't have access to that kind of education and resources. So, but it is also a real strong, could be a real strong unifier. You know, as a musician, I found it very powerful. So.
Yeah. Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
So going off your comments, I find it particularly interesting how class comes into this discussion of race. Like you mentioned earlier, like there's places where class is used kind of as an excuse to ignore other forms of oppression that occurs. But I think historically, or even contemporary in our society, class and race tend to very much intersect. So my question is basically how can class come into the conversation of race, and how class is racialized in many extents, but at the same time that can be a very sensitive subject in the United States when it comes to discussions about capitalism, about the distribution of resources and the power that comes along with those resources. So how can this discussion of interest convergence specifically apply an aspect of class to it? So, you know, how those with the resources may be interested in or having their interest, you know, be part of the conversation when it comes to, you know, trying to help historically marginalized communities or student groups or whatever it may be.
Your point is an important one. Race is a stubborn conceptualization, given its sort of historical trajectory, and it's difficult. It's difficult to conceptualize race sort of in its nuances, and I think we as researchers and this general public, we have to do a better job at that. An example given from the Colorado State Legislature is a prime example of that. So race and its understanding becomes becomes one way to think about how monies are distributed, and so in this case, that it would seem that people of color are understood in a particular kind of way, less about class and other kinds of ways of thinking about them, and that's kind of a larger problem of sort of a lack of sort of understanding intersectionality. We don't think like that. We don't operate like that, and that's because there's kind of historical precedence and sort of the power of the racial narrative, and class becomes really kind of a tough nut, if you will. Interesting if you look at kind of historical literature in education or education research over kind of historical spans, you can see how education researchers including education researchers are those in the disciplines who study education issues, sort of grapple with race, and then over time try to nuance class as a way of understanding kind of racialized experiences. But the interesting observation is, think about AERA is over 100 years old, there's been very little kind of progress in thinking about that. One assignment is to read the Coleman report and think about how class and race intersects. Sort of read it now in 2017 and see how far we've come, and read some other contemporary report about disparities in schools. I won't tell you what your observations will be, but you probably know them now.
And yeah, from a research perspective, but I'm also a civil rights lawyer, I often sort of grapple with researchers who are insisting on controlling for poverty all the time, when oftentimes it's very difficult, if not impossible, to disentangle. And it's because of racism that, right? So and then here's a, concrete example, especially when you're looking at a harmful practice like out-of-school suspensions. The idea, so folks will say, well, did you disaggregate your findings that, black kids are being suspended at, 3 or 4 times a rate, that there's schools where 50% of the black kids are being kicked out of school at least once, these horrific numbers, and people say, well, they didn't control for poverty, and I'm thinking, you shouldn't be kicking kids out who are poor, because it's not it's not educationally sound policy or practice to begin with. So why would poverty ever be an excuse to kicking out more poor kids? So, but from a researcher's perspective, I think folks get so ingrained, we got to control for this and control for that and control for a million different things without really paying attention to how entangled they are and how much one thing is impacted. The things you're controlling for are actually things you shouldn't be controlling for. And I think we have to do more as researchers to really unpack that and not always be thinking, oh, we should control for poverty or some of these other factors that have that confluence with race in a very negative way.
Yeah, thank you. There's one there, and then I'll be back.
So this question goes back to something we talked a little bit about earlier. I think a lady in the back brought it up, talking about racial progress, and was this a losing battle? And some of the responses talked about the possibility of changing hearts and minds. And in some ways, I think about that as asking someone to recognize your humanity, right? Asking for permission to have dignity. And so what does racial progress look like when we don't center racist in ending institutional racism?
Any takers? Stella?
Well, I think it looks like the Bakke decision, the Grutter decision, the Fisher decision, the Fisher II decision. It looks like allowing diversity but not acknowledging the racial history of this country. That's a real funky place to be, but that's what we have. And it's better than not having it, but it's a very strange, almost, Jorge Chapa used to call it a bipolar place to be. He referred to that as like needing immigrants but hating immigrants. So wanting diversity but not talking about why we need diversity. That's sort of where we are. And we can talk about racial history in schools and in universities, and we need to keep doing it. And maybe one day we'll have a court that acknowledges that in a different way. Certainly some members of the court do. But that, as I was hearing you talk, that's what came to mind immediately.
Importance of diversity and integration. It's so that because racially isolated white folks are much more likely to be racist, right? So that's how we get the Donald Trumps of the world, is when we have these entrenched, isolated patterns, and it's something that the white folks really wanted, anyhow. So it's but then the question is, why should other folks who are not, not the racists have the burden of solving? Is that sort of what you were getting at? Sort of why should it be? Oh, we have to integrate to address racism, but that's a difficult question. But I think at the end of the day, it is necessary to get from where we are to where we want to be.
Okay, I have a question here in the back.
So I've heard a lot of talks previous to this one that talk about relationship building, as you all talked about changing minds and hearts and people. And then I think the other end of the spectrum is all of this exists in an institutional structure, and that can also be relational, but I think it's relational in a very different way because of how big those systems are. And a lot of the research that I've heard about and read about talks about centering non-dominant perspectives, experiences, and ways of being and knowing. And the legal system, as it is currently, is very dominant. It is very white institutional America. So what other ways do you all see at an institutional level, like how to make change by centering non-dominant ideology?
I'm going to connect to your question, but I'm going to go back to this question, which I think is important, about the kind of search for humanity and understanding humanity of people in this country across this kind of historical arc. And I think that was the project that the nation that we've been engaged in. If you understand people as human with humanity, is that one way to think about racial progress, right? So do you still think black people are screaming baboons in 2016? I think we have indices where that's the case. And then how do you get to the hearts and minds, if you will, of those people or those institutions? I think it came to head around kind of issues of state-sanctioned violence through the police, and how certain cases of murders of young people in particular sort of raised this kind of consciousness that if institutions see and view and treat certain people in this way, and we have these bodies in the street, people wanted to now kind of rethink what's kind of racial progress have we made. And we've been engaged in this project of trying to change the soul and hearts of people by relational kind of strategies. And we actually have research that supports that, it may be true if we get black and brown, white people together in the same room and same classrooms, it has an effect on how we think about folk who are very different than us. But it's interesting, the nuance is the kind of relationships that you're involved in that informs how you think about food. So you can have relationships that are very negative. It's interesting if you look at racial attitudes of people who live in communities where there are fewer people who are matched with them racially and ethnically. Some of those data show that those folk have higher sort of perspectives or attitudes toward sort of other racial groups than folk who are in communities where there are larger representations, and they've had more engagement with people who are, because those engagements could be very negative, right? So I think it's sort of beyond the kind of relational, and I think researchers, particularly social scientists, have coming to understand and know that. I think we need to continue to think about the social contract that's connected to how do we force folk to understand and know the humanness of all folk. And if we can't, I don't think if we can't get there, we're not going to kind of solve this kind of intractable sort of racial problem in this country.
Well, and I think also, and there are studies about this, but it's beyond changing the hearts and minds, and I think at the very base level, we should have respect for each other's humanity. But then we need to be in rooms and in committees where we all have equal status, right? Because otherwise, there's going to be a power differential that is just too hard to overcome. And so when I was in Australia last summer for a fellowship, and I saw a lot of campaigns for multiculturalism, and this is just from being there for less than a month, so I might have this all wrong, but what I saw was multiculturalism, maybe what we did 20 years ago, in the sense that they're still. The posters I saw, the ads I saw, were trying to convince people that other people were just as equal. But as an American, what I want is to show you that I should have that job just as much as any other white man. So thank you for thinking I'm a human. I think I'm a human too, but I think I should have your job as well. And there should never be any doubt that I can qualify to do it. That's what I think is racial progress, beyond the humanity, but that we all have the opportunity to compete and not ever question that I am able to compete just because of who I am.
I hear these last two questions getting at something a little bit different, and I don't know that I don't know how to get there, but they're talking, what I'm hearing, and I don't know if I'm hearing it right, I'm hearing a critique of the frame, right? That we are centering whiteness in the way that we're thinking about the kinds of changes or the kinds of progress that we're pushing for, that we want to see. And is there a way that we as scholars can be a part of the project of decentering whiteness in this work? It's a tough question, because I was sitting here thinking about it, and it's partly tough because of the power dynamics, right? And the nature of the institutions and the society that we're thinking about. But any thoughts on thinking about doing this work from a place of decentering whiteness?
So if I walk into a room and I say, let's decenter whiteness, nobody's going to listen to me. Not in the rooms I go in. So I don't know. I have to figure out a way that uses language that they understand. So I'm open to listening. But that's why I'm sorry, but nobody's. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, if I go into the state legislature, they're going to kick me out. Like, I have to figure out a different way to I have to use different words. So please help me.
So I think it's true in that how we frame racial progress, how we frame thinking about disparities, how we frame the strategies to move toward kind of more sort of equitable solutions in not only in schools but sort of beyond. We're informed by that, I think, because of how we understand whiteness, right? And it's in the center of, particularly for folk who've been trained and developed as researchers, education researchers in particular, because it's the power of the institutions Having said that, it's not a lost cause in kind of sort of how we train. It's about sort of asking the right questions. If you can get beyond asking the right questions around the kind of these racial quagmires, if you will. And I do think, I agree, I do think there's some sort of discourse issues too, and kind of our rhetoric can be meaningful and meaningless at the same time. And I tend to be more of a pragmatist, and I think the older I get, right? So how do we get stuff? I don't know. Yeah, because as a boy growing up impoverished in Alabama, my family needed stuff, right? I needed shoes. I needed a bus to get to school that didn't stop at my house, right? So I'm becoming more pragmatic, sort of about that, and I think it's a project that we have to continuously be engaged with, because we want to ask the right questions. We want to enter the conversation and the discussion in the right places to get the kind of stuff that we need.
Although I will say, the word microaggressions is in the public sphere in a way I never thought it would be before, right? And that was the work of a lot of people.
Yeah, but so is acting white, right? Yes.
But,
so,
yeah, I mean, going back to implicit bias, I think that's helped a lot. Help white folks who, like me, I'm a civil rights lawyer, and you take the test, and then you see, oh, you don't like these. It's totally a disconnect, and you realize that you have a lot more thinking to do and reflecting at how you are being and how you are perceiving other people. But it's also true that, a lot of black people have implicit, everyone has implicit bias at some level that's damaging. It's not who you want to be, so what do you do about it? And I think that kind of research does really help, at least it's a step in the right direction.
I just wonder if we took this, like I thought where you were headed, would there be something different we would build? Would there be some different orientation to institutions? Anyway, yeah, you had a question.
I want to share about the findings of a pilot program that we did, and maybe that might give a different perspective on looking at this problem. Getting aware about the nuances. So looking beyond race and class, we looked at accents, having different accents. That could be a window into first step of identification of where the differences arise in breakdown in communication and separation and the otherness that gets created in that. So we did a little pilot program with the undergrad students to see how they were interacting with their foreign-born professors, and if training would help bring the two groups together in understanding as well as reducing some of these barriers. So what we found from that work, well, real quick, they were led through 8 weeks of listening to 54 varieties of accents in an online game, and it was a very low-stakes activity, and they just had to identify where this person is from, and then basically monitor their own scores and get better each week. And so they may have started off at guessing completely, and then by week 8, a lot of them had attained 80-90% accuracy on identification of where this person is from. Well, that was the premise, but looking at debriefing and looking at this, the outcomes, what we got was not only did the students improve in their accuracy of in the new skill that they built in listening to someone that they were not familiar with before, but interviewing them and doing reflections, we learned that they had now become aware of someone they would have never chosen to interact with on their own. They had gained confidence in feeling safe in that kind of activity, and also felt confidence in their own skills and the growth that they experienced. They reported on being curious in getting out there and now talking to more people from those countries, that they were actually being a lot more experimental with that. So that was pretty revelatory. Overall, yeah, so that went beyond generalizing what we did in the study. So what I picked up on all of those things is that this kind of work can also help with the race conversation, where instead of putting someone on the spot and asking someone to be aware of what kind of biases they may be bringing, if we indirectly involve them in some, instead of just getting people in the same room, but giving them activities where they are engaging with someone, on a completely different task, and then you start to develop, appreciation for the differences, experiencing yourself differently in that whole interaction. I think it's a matter of more confidence building rather than, breaking down the confidence building as a way to break down the preconceived biases. Oh, and last thing I want to say is we did measure a baseline as well as follow-up measure of their knowledge about differences and accents and how language differences start. We also looked at attitudes, and we looked at preferences, like would they actually choose to work with someone who's different. And we did see that they had grown from before and after. So again, I think that could be something maybe to pursue for the race conversation.
Thank you. Question? Yeah.
To decenter whiteness and make progress in terms of racial metrics and get stuff, as you said, because it's more than stuff. And I know you mean that. Well, I hope you do. All of you are lawyers, forgive me, you say your background. Okay. Has there been any aggressive initiative in changing law? Not contributing to policy, but actually changing law, as when we see Brown versus Board and other decisions, how there was an intentional effort in galvanizing cases all across the United States to go forth and change law that can address decentering whiteness and dismantling those structures.
Well, I think I don't know if it's would be fully decentering whiteness, and I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. But I think the disparate impact standard in discrimination law is an important one. And there was, under the Obama administration, there was the Department of Justice and the Department of Education got together and issued guidance that really, it was already part of the regulations under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And basically it says this. It says if there is a policy or practice that is harming one group more than another, and it's not just around race, national origin, gender, and so forth. If there's not an educationally necessity for that, and it's having that impact, then it's unlawful. So you don't have to get to intent or prove that someone was, malicious, or this much higher standard is very difficult to prove. It's basically the data will drive this if you don't have an educationally sound justification, or even if you can provide one, if there's a less discriminatory alternative, then it still violates civil rights. And that was very powerful, and it's hard to implement it as well as it needed to be implemented. But I think it really got folks looking at the numbers and raising these questions. This can't possibly be fair, whether it's resource distribution, school discipline, who's identified as gifted and talented. All these things would be on their face. If there's not a justification why things look this different, then it's unlawful, and it has to change. So I think that was at least an important step in the right direction.
A question for Dan that's connected to your question. So, are the courts being used at this historical moment to advance kind of the racial agenda, kind of historic racial agenda? Are we past that? As we were in the 60s and with different courts, right? So do we still depend on the courts to continue to make those advances in racial progress?
Yeah, Yeah, and even with regard to that legal standard change, I've always said never depend on the courts, and so the answer is no.
We depended on the courts.
Right.
We devised a whole strategy,
right? But as
around,
you know,
particularly around schools.
Right, but even with all deliberate speed, I mean, the court sort of punted when it came time to enforcing the requirements in Brown, and it was only through politics and getting the Civil Rights Act, and also having the leverage of
we
the
couldn't
money.
get there without the decision of the court, though.
No, that's right, right. So it was important, but it wasn't. It was right. Necessary. Exactly.
But there have been some
Yes.
recent been some recent efforts. I was a part of a group last year after AERA, the day after or the end of the last day, we went and met with some civil rights attorneys in DC who were launching a national effort utilizing some of Sean Reardon's data to look at where disparities exist and target legal actions to particular districts and cities. So I think that work is. Did you know?
Oh,
this?
yeah. So I think, and there's state courts are different than federal courts, and so there's some opportunities. I mean, as a lawyer, you take every opportunity, when it presents itself. So I didn't mean there are none, but I think if you looked at the legal landscape these days, it's not, especially, look who they just stole a seat from the Supreme Court, and so it's hard to be really optimistic about the courts being the sort of mover and shaker the way they were in the 60s. Right now, I think had we gotten an Obama appointee on that Supreme Court, it would have, and also how a lot of the federal judges were delayed, and there's still vacant federal seats that probably should have been filled. So that's where I was coming from. Not that there are definitely some.
Just it's a constrained strategy. Right. Well, let's end with maybe just one thought on this work moving forward, and maybe one hopeful thought on this work moving forward. What gives you hope in what you've seen in the research literature, or what's kind of one kind of final hopeful point you want to make?
A hopeful point is actually advancement of technology and social media, which is providing particularly young people and the sort of generations, alternative generations, sort of access not only to information, but platforms to understand and engage in these issues that have been raised today. So I think we have to be mindful and conscious. Even we have these technologies and now these sort of social media platforms, but sort of monitor how they will be used in the future for the good and bad, and sort of reaching our agenda of racial progress. Yes.
I think I would say, so sort of an A and B to that point. And A is that things have been worse, right? And I don't know if this is from my Catholic background, so my dad told me all the time, things could always be worse. So things have been worse. Oh, yeah, probably. I don't know. So there's that, and then I think it's important to recognize there has been progress in law and policy. And we might be in a dark time right now, but it's not forever. And I think that people have, true civil rights warriors know you can't base hopes based on a 4-year period. It's going to go way beyond this, and you have to have stamina in the game. And the people before us had stamina in the game. And the second point is, you know what? There is no other country I would rather be a Mexican American woman in. I can't imagine having this level of opportunity in another country. Where else does a woman of color, become a Harvard-educated professor? Like, I just, and I study other countries enough, so maybe there is one. If you guys know of it, let me know. But I think that there's still hope in this nation, and I'm staying here. I'm not going anywhere.
I think the one of the greatest signs of hope for me was when Trump tried to institute his Muslim ban, and all of a sudden, ACLU lawyers, other lawyers, and people and protesters, not just lawyers, everybody was there's an outpouring and saying this is unjust. And I don't think that you would have seen that in the 50s. I think there has been some transformation of a critical mass of people, and maybe having some of these bad things happen is galvanizing people so that maybe it never happens again. This will be a very short blip on the radar screen, and that's what I'm hopeful that and I think that's a concrete reason to hope when you see that outpouring and you see it worked. They stopped it, and in the courts as well. So.
Okay, now for real, join me in thanking the panelists.